Good morning, everybody. Dear friends, dear human rights defenders attending today, dear diplomatic colleagues, very happy to see you here, including the Chargé d'Affaires of the US, Mike Heath. This is the Santa Lucia Day in Sweden. Some of you may have attended Santa Lucia celebrations with our embassy over the years. We had one 2 days ago, which was not the accurate day, as you understand. This is the real Santa Lucia Day. And in that spirit, some of you have already grabbed, I'm happy for that, these saffron buns. And that gingerbread as well. That's the core. If you have a Santa Lucia, you have a saffron bun, you have gingerbread, and maybe a nice Christmas tune, at least ringing in your head. Then you are in the Santa Lucia spirit. But today we are here for a totally different reason. 3 days ago, the world celebrated International Human Rights Day, as we all know, this year marking 71 years since the Universal Declaration was adopted by the United Nations. That declaration provides a message that resonates loud and clear through the decades that have passed since 1948. We have seen remarkable progress these decades, but recently also a disturbing, deteriorating global trend, in particular in the area of freedom of expression. We have seen authoritarian leaders gaining ground in many parts of the world. We have seen a shrinking space for civil society. We have seen human rights defenders constantly being under attack, not least women. Women who defend and promote rights are often the first to come under attack. And they are targeted as a result of the work they do, especially, not only, but especially when they address issues related to gender and sexuality and challenge discriminatory social and cultural norms. The European Union, where Sweden is a proud and engaged member, is based on core global values like democracy and human rights. So many countries on our continent have suffered tremendously during dark days of violence and oppression. And our union was formed and enlarged based exactly on these experiences. That makes the European Union, and certainly Sweden as a member, a strong, committed, dedicated advocate for a rules-based order with human rights as major cornerstones. Now, I met Kun Sirikan June Charansiri for the first time, I think almost 4 years ago. I met Kun Ankana Nilapajit more or less at the same time. Might even have been the same day, actually. I believe there was some lunch in our residence. And somewhat later, I also got to know Pranom B. Somwong. And I've constantly been struck and impressed by their professionalism, their energy, their dedication, and their courage. The same can be said about so many of their colleagues, several of you being here this morning. So many of your colleagues, human rights defenders here in Thailand and in the region. The exhibition we'll launch here today is called Gender Equal World, a tribute to those fighting for women's rights. Produced by the Swedish Institute and with photos taken by Annette Brolenius, by a coincidence in life, a former colleague of mine. I got to know her 28 years ago. The portraits were taken at the Stockholm Forum on Gender Equality last year, where Kun June attended on invitation by our government. And that forum was organized as a part of the Swedish feminist foreign policy, launched 2014 and based on what we say is the 3 R's: rights, resources, and representation. And a 4th R could actually be added: reality. Reality meaning discrimination and systematic subordination still characterizing the lives of so many women and girls throughout the world. And being father of 2 daughters, I'm constantly reminded of that simple but absurd fact that this is the reality. This is the reality for half of the world's population, including those 2 and including many of you sitting here today. The 16 days of activism against gender-based violence that ended December 10th have given us countless, often horrifying, often appalling examples of these practices. Human rights certainly need defenders. Sadly enough, human rights defenders also need defenders. It shouldn't have to be that way, but it is. And that's a major reason why we are here today. To pay tribute to women human rights defenders, to reflect upon their situation and discuss what more could be done by people like us, myself, for them, for you, and by all of us together. Many thanks to all of you sitting here for coming. A special word of welcome and gratitude to Clara Backman from Kvinna till Kvinna, Woman to Woman, an organization I got to know and admire during my years as a regional director for Central and Eastern Europe at SIDA, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. And a special word of gratitude and welcome to Cynthia Velico, a colleague I highly appreciate, a colleague from a crucially important institution, UNOHCHR, an institution that we, my country and government, strongly support. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Your Excellency, Stefan, distinguished diplomats and colleagues, friends, everybody who come here today. It is my humble honor to be speaking today in the week that we commemorate the International Human Rights Day, and also on this event to open this photo exhibition that for me is the emphasizing of the lives and challenges of those who are fighting for the equal world, for the gender equality, and for human rights. As I look at these photos that portrait here today, 15 of them are here, I would like to recall my memories when I attended the Global Gender Equality Conference in Stockholm last year, as Ambassador Stefan mentioned about, because I am truly thankful to the embassy and for giving me the opportunity to go to the forum. I have learned a lot and I appreciated that opportunity. I have increased my awareness and my knowledge about global practices on gender equality and non-discrimination, while strengthening the rule of law and democracy in the same time. Coming from Thailand, it was an eye-opening event for me to know more about Swedish feminist foreign policy and their efforts to make them into action. And I was inspired to see strong female leadership at the very high level political capacity in Sweden and other countries, and also to be among those who have devoted to the same values in all different parts of the world. So several key messages that I take notes and I want to share. First, We all need to respect each other and encourage everyone to join and support the movements on equal rights and justice for all. It is essential to bring forward voices of women, girls, and others, including from civil society and local communities. Because when women are empowered, so are their families, so are their children or future generation. Then their communities, their nations, their countries are empowered. Second, I think there was a need to promote democratic and civil space, free media, freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, public participation, to create an environment in which women, girls, everybody, civil society, ordinary people can actively engage in the decision making and hold those in power accountable. We need to counter the shrinking democratic space, the collapsing of the rule of law, the decline of democracy, where women, girls, and vulnerable people are often excluded, where human rights defenders, activists, media, or dissidents often become the target of intimidation and harassment. Third, we also need to include and increase male participation when discussing and work on gender equality and equal rights. We need support from families. I need support from my father, from my brothers, from my uncles, from everyone, so that we all can become active agents of our society. As one keynote speaker said at a conference that I always remember until today, is that we must move forward towards the day that gender equality is a matter of fact, not a matter of fight. This applies to me and applies to Thailand, that we must move forward toward the day that respect for human rights and democracy are deeply rooted in our society, that we do not go backward due to time during which we don't have guarantees of rights and freedoms, or slip back to any undemocratic governance, until it's a matter of fact, not a matter of fight. And before I went to the Stockholm forum, I received an email from the Swedish Institute and telling me that Annette, the photographer, invited me to take part in her Unsung project. It's the project that took the photography of human rights defenders around the world. I said yes right away. At the conference before meeting Annette, I actually saw some of her collections exhibited in the hallway. And I'm very happy that I saw the portrait of a friend of mine that exhibited there, which I like to mention about her, if you bear with me for a minute. Kiruba Munusamy. She's an advocate at the Supreme Court of India, and she's also a human rights activist. She works against caste and gender-based discrimination in her country. I had a chance to be friends and met her in the Netherlands during our 3-month temporary relocation for human rights defenders to a safe space under the Dutch Shelter City program. When I looked at her photo exhibited that was taken by Annette at the forum, it expressed all her personalities, such strong eyes, looking sharp and focused. Well, because I know her personally, so I knew her story. Kiruba told me her stories, that she went through several harassment, physical, mental, sexual attacks as a result of her work and activism, and because of her identities of race, caste, and gender. She said she was one stabbed with a knife, but she survived. I was actually shocked when I heard such a story, and I was eating my pad thai when I cook for my friends. But she continued on explaining her complex situation that happened in her country like nothing happened, and that she never get tired of it. I sincerely admire her for her perseverance, tolerance, determination to keep fighting after all those terrible attacks and risks against her. I am also proud that her portrait is included for the exhibition here today as well. She's one of the 15 photos here. And now coming to my own photo, there. At the conference, though, during a coffee break, I went for the shooting and I met with Annette. Annette was quite impressive herself when I met her, because she ran the pop-up photo booth, during the breaks all by herself. She told me briefly about the shooting and asked me about my situation, Thailand situation, and then she started shooting. And to be honest, I did not really remember exactly of what feelings or, when Anne took this photo of mine. I do recall that she asked me to think and express the feelings when I had to fight for human rights back home. I think I was so focused, like what would be the look if I fight in court, or if I fight in the street, or if I fight for my clients who deprived of their rights and liberty. Several photos was taken, and it was so quick. And there was also another female activist in line for the next shooting, and she told me she would select one photo and then will tell me later. Annette also asked me the reason I do this job, I do this work, and about my inspiration. I told her simple reasons, because I respect myself, so I respect others. I want to defend rights of my loved ones, so I do the same for others. So defend one can defend all. And as to my inspiration, there were so many people in my life, or so many of you here, that have inspired me to do this work. In particular, those who stand up against the military dictatorship and fight for justice as human rights violations in Thailand and around the world. And here comes the photos that Annette shows of mine. And well, I should have anticipated this. She would choose this raw, fierce, serious look. And I should also have remembered that I forgot to put some makeup on before the shooting. Well, one thing I found fascinating about Anne's photography, at least looking at my own though, I always have different thoughts about what exactly I was thinking or feeling through that look. Perhaps, it's and also why I have that fist under my chin, and maybe it's a kind of default posting. But maybe I was focused, thinking of fighting against military dictatorship back home, or thinking of helping people who suffered. Or I might have felt actually angry or hungry. Hungry for food or hungry for justice. Or I might have just been so exhausted to put up my smile to those oppressors, those in power, full of men, that acting that I am no harm, I am an obedient woman. Or perhaps I want to reveal my true self, my true feelings. I guess it's just a mix of feelings, different feelings, when one has to struggle on. So therefore, I would like to invite you all to visit the exhibition and read through some of the stories, have a look at these portraits that narrate the story of those who fight and still fighting for human rights and justice, and make some guess or interpretation of your own, of their feelings. What would an individual with such story would feel or think or want to tell you through photography? Lastly, I would like to especially thank you again to Ambassador Stefan, our colleagues, the Swedish Embassy, for always supporting at personal level, and also supporting our work through this difficult time, and also to many others here who continue to support our work. Thank you to Annette, who document and tell the stories of human rights defenders through her photography. Thank you to those who have struggled on and still move forward. I hope that until things are the matter of facts, it's not the matter of fight. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kunjun, for an extremely inspiring speech. What would an event like this be without a group photo? Could I first invite the speakers up here? they will take a group photo, and then there will be a second group photo. And I would suggest if you could start standing there. And I think the second group photo, if all of you being here that would like to be part of the group photo, will then be invited to join us here at the podium. But first this one, and then a second one. We had one with Conjun in the middle. And I can stand here. And then everyone, including diplomatic colleagues who want to join us, please. Yes, yes. End of photo session. And let me now hand over the floor to our MC for today, Konmontira Nakvichen from UN Women, also an organization that is very close to the heart of Sweden and to many of us here. Konmontira, the floor is yours.
Ambassador Hastram, Diplomatic Corps, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen, we're commemorating the 10th of December of International Human Rights Day, as well as we're commemorating the 29th November, which marks the United Nations International Women Human Rights Defenders Day. We honor the women whose courageous efforts and sometimes whose lives and dignities are given in defense of the universal human rights agenda and women's empowerment. From feminist activists protecting the equal enjoyment of fundamental freedoms to environmentalists fighting for the rights of indigenous people and their lands. I'm very humbled to have these honorable speakers with me on the panel. Could I please invite Clara Backman? Clara Backman is an advocacy advisor at the Kvinna till Kvinna Foundation in Sweden. Kvinna till Kvinna, in translations, Woman to Woman Foundation, has since 1993 worked with supporting women's rights in conflict-affected countries. Today, they supported over 130 women's rights organizations in 20 countries in Central and Western Africa, the Middle East, the South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. Kvinna till Kvinna worked with both financial support, capacity building, networking, and movement building for local organizations, as well as regional and international advocacy on women's rights issues. Clara has very humbly told me, and she asked me not to mention it, but I think we're trying to make a very close connection, that she is also serving in the Swedish Foreign Ministry. Clara knew almost all of these women's rights, human rights defenders on the wall, and she has a very close connection to all of them. And I hope that at the end of the session today, you will be asking her questions about their lives and her past experiences working closely with them. Next, may I please invite Cynthia Veliko, Regional Representative for the UN Human Rights Office for Southeast Asia. Cynthia has worked across the UN system since 1999 with the Department of Political Affairs, where Cynthia was assigned to the Cyprus proximity talks in New York, and then deployed to Haiti for the parliamentary and presidential elections in 2000. Cynthia served with the OHCHR since March 2006 as Human Rights Advisor in 3 countries, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines, and was appointed in August 2017 as regional representative to UN Human Rights Body. Could I please invite Kun Angkana Nilapaijet, the former and chairperson of Justice for Peace Foundation. Kun Angkana Nilapaijet is a former commissioner for Thailand's Office of National Human Rights Commission. Kun Angkana entered the human rights field after her prominent human rights lawyer husband was forcibly disappeared in 2004. Kun Angkana received numerous awards and honors, including Gwangju Prize for Human Rights, Women Human Rights Defender by the European Parliament, and Honor de Chevalier de l'Ordre de la Légion d'Honneur from the French President Nicolas Sarkozy, Prominent Women Human Rights Defender by the Senate House, Women of Achievement by UN Women, and the recently Ramon Magsaysay Awards. Congratulations. Last, may I please invite Kun Pranom Sombong, Thailand representative for Protection International. Protection International is an international nonprofit organization that supports human rights defenders in developing their security and protection management strategies. Protection Desk Thailand has been working and supporting local grassroots initiatives, organizations, and human rights defenders at risk of defending economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights and freedoms, including community rights in rural and semi-rural areas. It has become the focal point for information and strategic advice on issues concerning community-based human rights defenders for international non-organizations. All of the speakers would have 15 minutes each, and we will welcome the next round after an hour of our vibrant discussions with questions and answers from the floor. May I please invite Ms. Bachmann?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Swedish Embassy for inviting me to this panel. As mentioned, I was also at the Stockholm Gender Forum, and it was a very inspiring event for me as well. I got to meet many of the amazing activists showcased here today, so it really feels like coming full circle in a way. So, as mentioned, Kvinna till Kvinna works with over 130 local partner organizations, unfortunately not in Asia, at least not yet, but I will try to give something of a global overview on the issue of shrinking space for women human rights defenders. Last year, Kvinna till Kvinna did a survey which resulted in a report where we asked 123 prominent women human rights defenders from 32 countries on how they are affected by shrinking space. And the resulting report was called Suffocating the Movement. And here we have tried to bring light to the negative consequences for women's movements and also call to action to ensure safe spaces for women to organize and claim their rights. And just a few weeks ago, we published a follow-up report called The Fierce and the Furious, which looks closer on how women human rights defenders are specifically targeted by what we call the anti-gender movement. So, starting a little bit from the beginning, what do we actually mean by shrinking space? What we refer to is the development of criminalization and bureaucratization of human rights work in many countries, which results for a limited space for civil society. The latest numbers from Civicus Monitor are that now only 3% of the world's population live in countries with a fully open civic space. And 40% live in what they categorize as repressed countries. And that's a number that's up from 19 only since last year. So this is really a development that we're seeing now. In the Arab region, Middle East and North Africa region, we have seen that after the Arab Spring, many governments have come to fear the power of social movements, especially as mobilization can be very swift with social media. And there our partners really bear witness to a harsher climate and increasing attacks and threats on women human rights. And shrinking space can take on many different forms, but here are some recurrent key characteristics. It's often the matter of limiting the ability for civil society to receive international funding. In many cases, governments increase the control over organizations that are seen as dissident voices. So, for example, this can be extra registration, licensing, reporting, accounting, and just basically paperwork. Many countries have placed new restrictions on the rights to assembly, association, and public protests. And organizations and activists also experience intimidation and violent attacks from right-wing extremists, from religious fundamentalists, and sometimes also government officials. And moving on to what we call the gendered aspects of shrinking space, so what women human rights defenders experience. Shrinking space obviously hits all organizations hard, but there are also specific ways in which women rights organizations are attacked, which we found in our report, where 85% of the respondents believe that women human rights activists are affected differently than male activists. I do want to point out here that it's not that all women or women's organizations are affected in exactly the same way, and the vulnerability and exposure of women activists also follow other power structures, so ethnicity, sexual identity, gender identity, and class. But since women's rights organizations already struggle with financing and often work with extremely little resources, when restrictions are put on foreign funding, they are hit very hard by this. And 33% of our respondents in the EU state that women's organizations have less access to funds. So even there. And activists, journalists, and politicians are under constant threat of violence, which is also often sexualized. More than half of the respondents, and in conflict-affected areas, it's 72%, have been exposed to violence or threats of violence. And shaming and slander campaigns are very common to try to push women activists to withdraw from public life. For example, 55% of our respondents have faced direct threats online. And this also connects to a rise of traditional values, where shrinking space often overlaps with growing fundamentalist discourses on national identity and traditional patriarchal values. 58% of the respondents in our report thinks that nationalism is one of the main reasons for shrinking space, and half of the respondents think that fundamentalism and increasing religious influence in politics has affected women's rights organizations. So there is this increased emphasis on women's traditional roles as mothers, as wives, as caregivers, rather than as actors and political actors with a political voice. And since women human rights defenders challenge the traditional female roles, they are threatened, they are marginalized, and they are placed under suspicion. And the strategies to then hurt them are also gendered. They include rape or threats of rape, that women that speak out in public are placed under scrutiny and shamed as sluts or traitors or spies. And there are also, of course, cases of them being arrested and having their offices raided. Women and LGBT persons are subjected to sexual violence. They are also sometimes outed to their families or to the public. And attacking women is a very effective tool. So there are many reports of women being shamed or exposed online, for example, by spreading compromising material of women of sexual nature. So we see this sort of link between the gender backlash and shrinking space. This backlash we have outlined in our new report, where we can see that the situation for feminist activists in Europe and in the MENA region is worsening. Some numbers from there are that 58% encounter that the terms gender ideology, women's rights, LGBTQI+, are used in aggressive or negative ways several times a week. And 73% say that this negative discourse has increased in just the last 2 or 3 years. We also see an increase here of arguments used against feminist activists that we have seen in context of shrinking space for a long time. So arguments such as that feminists destroys families, feminist destroys traditional values, feminism is a Western influence, gender equality has gone too far, or that feminism introduces a third sex. So we can also see that the shrinking space has consequences for the political role of the women's movement. There is a lack of recognition of women as drivers of change, connected to gender stereotypes. And women's rights organizations have always, I would say, been used to facing these obstacles, but then the shrinking space adds to this challenge. And we see a development of women's organizations being steered from political work and political action into service provision, which is perceived as less threatening work by those in power. And this makes it very difficult for women's organizations to push for political change. And when these organizations also struggle to finance their work and are threatened and harassed, this then marginalizes them politically. Moving on to where we can see some different regional trends. There are a lot of similarities, of course, as I have mentioned, but there are also some differences. So what they all have in common, I would say, is that these gender strategies to threaten and intimidate women, they are everywhere. The space is shrinking also in Europe and in the European Union, which is important to remember. So there we can see restrictions of freedom of assembly in countries like Poland, but also actually in Spain. Developments in Europe are often connected to restrictions on SRHR, sexual and reproductive rights, and the right to abortion. And we can also see in Europe that there are examples of both state and non-state actors creating a backlash on women's rights, also in countries like Sweden, where nationalist and neo-Nazi groups have targeted and threatened feminist activists and journalists, and actually in a few cases made them retire from their work. And these are of course very worrisome tendencies, showing us that shrinking space is also happening in democratic states. In the MENA region, as I mentioned, we had increased regulations after 9/11 and in connection to or after the Arab Spring. And here it's common that counter-terrorism measures are used by repressive governments to control and limit civil society. And part of those measures are also banking regulations, which makes it very impossible to fund civil society in a few of these countries that are marked as high risk for terrorism. And linking this to the Asia-Pacific region, here we see a few other aspects of shrinking space. It's often connected to the environmental and indigenous movements. We see that authoritarian states are prioritizing economic development over human rights. So human rights is often the first thing to go. and that this results often in legal struggles between grassroots activists and the state. One example being the case of the land and human rights defenders in Ban Sapwai in Chayapum province, I hope that was okay pronunciation, that have been prosecuted for defending their right to farm the land that their community have been farming for a really long time. And this case has been raised both by the Indigenous Women's Network of Thailand and Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. And here we can see that legislation and policy that might have been from the start intended to combat climate change, so a good thing, is being used by the government to displace farming communities. And I think a connection can be made to how counterterrorism measures in other contexts are used by authoritarian governments to crack down on civil society, claiming that it's for a good cause. And here, the fight against climate change is used in the political rhetoric in a similar way. So the civil society arena is hugely important for political work on gender equality. Groups like women who are more excluded from formal political arenas need civil society to act and to mobilize and to demand our rights. And a strong women's movement is the single most important factor for a country to improve its legislation on women's rights and gender-based violence, and that legislation is actually then also complied with. So if women's organizations and human rights defenders are cut off, we risk losing all these achievements that actually is a result of their work.
Clara, we have exactly.
So now my final slides on our recommendations. And these were actually workshopped with a group of around 80 activists. And I believe June was one of them in Stockholm at the Gender Forum. So this is not only from Kvinna till Kvinna, this is from a global group of activists on what can be done. And these are our recommendations to the international community. On personal and organizational safety and security, do not compromise. Always put women human rights on the agenda. Also be aware of who you engage with. Civil society is not only benign, there's also presence of government-organized NGOs, business-organized NGOs, and religious-organized NGOs. So these are the gongos, bongos, rongos that are also a threat to the independent civil society. And have a zero tolerance against both the criminalization of women human rights defenders and the violence against them. On funding and financing, invest in women's agency through long-term funding of women's rights organization and support their advocacy work. Fund new movements and voices, so don't always just go to the usual suspects to support projects. And don't pull out your funding in the very difficult environments, because that's when they need it the most. So try to find creative ways to fund and support activists. And on recognition and access, it's really important to recognize and highlight their work publicly. And also to support movement building, since this pushback on women's rights is global. Women's society also needs to be global.
Thank you. Thank you, Clara. I'm sure that we'll come back again to these very crucial recommendations and some questions from the floor. We have an excellent timekeeper right on our right hand, so then we're excellent in timekeeping so far. May I just please concisely give an overall picture of what you have presented to us. It's very clear that women human rights defenders are being criminalized for advocating for women's rights to make decisions about their even reproductive health, ostracized by their communities for speaking out in public and digital spaces for the equal enjoyment of human rights, and subject to sexual violence and harassment for exercising their right to participate in public debate. Those who experience multiple interesting forms of gender-based discriminations that you outlined, such as Indigenous women and LGBTIQ activists, are particularly at risks. Yet these violations often go unreported, undocumented, and uninvestigated, perpetuating impunity and further entrenching gender inequality. So she came up with an excellent recommendations in areas of personal and organizational, such as safety and security for women human rights defenders, funding and financing, investing, or even pull out the fund at a very strategic time, not in a way that would harm the organization. And lastly, recognition and their access to fundings and as well as to justice itself. Without further ado, may I please invite Cynthia to provide us Asian Pacific overview.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'd like to thank the Embassy of Sweden for the opportunity to be with you today and for focusing this morning's discussion on women human rights defenders. This discussion is very timely, for we are at a pivotal point in the history, one of increased activism by women and girls around the world. We see change happening in big and small ways through legal reform and judicial decisions, policy changes, and collective action of women themselves. The historical and structural inegalities that have allowed oppressive and discrimination to flourish are being exposed as never before. From Latin America to Europe to Asia, on social media, film sets, factory floors, executive offices, and in the streets, there are campaigns and movements such as Me Too, women who are calling for lasting change and zero tolerance for sexual assault, harassment, and discrimination of all kinds. The discussion is also timely, for we are witnessing a period where, as has been said earlier this morning, public discourse against human rights is on the rise. States are adopting narratives that are hostile to human rights and to human rights defenders. Women's rights are facing troubling setbacks. There is resistance to progress, and those defending women's rights are being vilified. They are facing slander and backlash, but also stigma, threats, and intimidation from within their families and their own communities. This is compounded by discriminatory social norms and laws, which remain powerful obstacles to protection, equal rights, and opportunities for women. In Southeast Asia, as is the case globally, we note that legal, political, and administrative measures are being selectively applied to further restrict the space for human rights work. Laws on cybersecurity, anti-terrorism, fake news, sedition, and other legislation are being routinely used by states to stifle dissent and activism. Threats to free media continue at a disturbing rate. New technologies are being misused to establish digital walls, surveillance, and individual data collection. Social media is often used to fuel hate speech against social, religious, and ethnic minorities. At the same time, people are increasingly being penalized for views opposed to governments that they express online, including for allegedly, quote, scandalizing the judiciary or defaming politicians or government officials by expressing valid concerns on social media. In many of these cases, legitimate activism and dissent are criminalized as treason or terrorism. In a number of countries in the region, known human rights defenders and activists are routinely banned from traveling to and participating in events, including in the UN sphere, as an all too effective measure to silence them. Of concern is also the growing regional trend of use of strategic legislation against public participation, more commonly referred to as SLAPP. Those lawsuits are increasingly being used by corporations to intimidate or bring charges against individuals or civil society organizations who have criticized or made public allegations against bad business practices, notably regarding allegations of environmental degradation or human rights abuses. Governments stand by without taking necessary action, despite commitments being made in the context of the guiding principles on business and human rights. As noted by UN experts, the use of SLAPP, criminal defamation charges, against human rights defenders serve only to criminalize their legitimate human rights work and too often serve to violate the rights of freedom of expression. While facing the same risks as their male counterparts, as we have heard already this morning, women human rights defenders often face additional and different hazards. As the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders observed in a report earlier this year, these risks are gendered, intersectional, and shaped by entrenched gender stereotypes and deeply held ideas and norms about who women are and how women are to be. Additional risks are faced by women human rights defenders working on rights that are deemed culturally inappropriate or criticized by extremist, misogynistic groups or corporate powers, such as women's sexual and reproductive health and health rights, LGBTI-related issues, and rights related to land, natural resources, and environment. The scale and depth of this trend is of great concern, including in this region. Often living in patriarchal societies, women's voices are stifled, and they are prevented from participating in critical and relevant societal discourse. In Southeast Asia, as in many parts of the world, women activists and human rights campaigners are threatened by the rise of extremist ideologies and powerful interest groups that lack public accountability. At the heart of this power lies the perpetuation of political narratives and social norms that make life increasingly difficult and dangerous for women. It criminalizes activists and stigmatizes sexual minorities. Women human rights defenders in particular are those advocating for more egalitarian interpretations of religion, questioning acts of moral policing and promoting gender equality and non-discrimination, or upholding the rights of LGBTI, risk being subjected to arbitrary arrest, harassment, and intimidation by both state and non-state actors. Attacks against women human rights defenders often take gender-specific forms, including gendered verbal and sexual abuse and threats, and acts of rape. Women, particularly victims of sexual harassment and violence in online and offline spaces, find themselves in vulnerable positions under legal systems that do not recognize online sexual harassment as a form of abuse, and subsequently, many of these egregious and violent online cases go unaddressed. Cyber stalking, image manipulation, and privacy violations are other technologically related forms of violence used to threaten and silence women human rights defenders. We also know that this region vacillates between ranking first and second most deadly in the world over the past decade for environmental human rights defenders to operate, the majority of those killed being indigenous people, with women included amongst their ranks. Those at risk are also women human rights defenders who speak out on behalf of indigenous communities, or those that are from rural or inaccessible areas where land and territories are increasingly at threat. The expansion of extractive industries, including forestry, oil and gas, and mining in Southeast Asia and the surrounding region, have been rapid and often highly contested. In most cases, without appropriate governance frameworks, extractive projects capitalize on and reinforce power imbalances, especially regarding resource access, ownership, and decision-making. While corporate entities and political elites largely benefit through substantial economic gains, local livelihoods, social structures, and ecosystems are often gravely affected by such projects, disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable, including women. Yet women HRDs are rarely engaged in decision-making, conflict resolution, and resource management processes, despite the centrality of participation being at the heart of the 2030 development agenda. Many defenders, including women, have paid with their lives for resisting development projects or demanding participation in the planning of these projects that affect their territories and resources. Geographically dispersed, they can find it difficult to connect with relevant authorities or fellow human rights defenders. According to Global Witness and Frontline Defenders' 2018 global analyses, environment and land defenders were amongst the highest risk groups in Asia, targeted by states, corporations, local vested interest groups, and others. Growing surveillance capacities and the use of militarized options to deal with domestic public security often heighten existing intercommunal tensions and conflict, intensifying and exacerbating existing discrimination and violence against minorities or those who are critical of governments and their policies, leading to increased risks and challenges for human rights defenders, and most notably for women. Yet women human rights defenders across the region are organizing communities, building collective protection, and mobilizing urgent action, while also advocating for legislation for protection of human rights defenders, indigenous activists dealing with powerful extractive industries such as palm oil and logging companies, and those on the rights of marginalized ethnic groups are taking precautions and becoming more strategic about organizing public events. Ladies and gentlemen, as emphasized by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, when civil society demands while civil society channels flow freely, it means vibrant debate, freedom of thought and opinion, and public engagement in policy. While debate is stifled and opposition voices are silenced, it means increasing repression, growing tension, and risk of explosive rage. It means the truth is suppressed and populism will thrive. The UN founding principles make clear that civil society is not an optional extra for states. The Universal Declaration, an extraordinary document which underpins international human rights law and inspires us to continue to work to ensure all people gain freedom, equality, and dignity. It grants people the right to hold opinions that differ from their governments, to associate with political parties that do not espouse the same ideas or policies as the elite, to mobilize individuals for legitimate purposes, and to peacefully protest against laws, policies, and practices that are not in consonance with the rights that are enshrined in the UDHR. We know from history that the fear of challenging culture and tradition should not hold us back from creating just societies. From our work with women human rights defenders across the region, we know that they have wisdom to share, much to show about resilience and persistence, and to teach us about being powerful advocates for human rights, even in the face of significant personal risk. The coming year will also provide a key opportunity to support women human rights defenders, as 2020 will mark 25 years since the international community adopted by consensus the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, committing to advance the goals of equality, development, and peace. It is vital that we continue to push forward to meaningfully deliver on gender equality. This will not only empower women and girls, it will enrich our societies politically, socially, and economically. Today and every day, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights honors the women and girls who have transformed our societies, and we pay tribute to those who are courageously on the front lines of defending people's rights. We stand by women human rights defenders in respect of their goals, their commitment, and their dedication. Women are changing the world, and we're not done yet.
Thank you very much for your very insightful. Ladies and gentlemen, at a time where gender equality agenda is jeopardized by the rise of misogyny, and we head towards the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action, 25 years ago endorsed in consensus by member states in Beijing, China. The work for women human rights defenders is more important than ever, so that we continue to build a strong and resilient movement of irreversible progress towards gender equality and empowerment of women and girls everywhere. We stand, as Cynthia called, in solidarity with the hundreds and thousands of women, human rights defenders, activists who are leading the fight for the equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And we reaffirm our commitment here to support and protect them in their efforts. Without further ado, may I please invite Kun Angkana Nilapaijet to provide us the national overview.
Thank you very much, Kun Montila, and good morning, everyone. Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, and happy Santa Lucia today. I'm very humbled to join this panel, and my special thanks to Ambassador Staffan to make this happen. For experience in Thailand since 1995 until 2014, there are around 38 women and human rights defenders who were killed and disappeared. And most of all, the perpetrators never brought to justice, and impunity still remains. On 2016, during the UPR Thailand review, Thailand adopted a lot of recommendations to protect human rights defenders and to investigate all the cases of women and human rights defenders who were killed and disappeared in the past decade. In March 2017, the ICCPR committee seriously concerned about the widespread impunity for those crimes and the slow progress in investigating the cases of human rights defenders who were killed and disappeared, such as the enforced disappearance of Somchai Nilapaichit and Polity Obili Lakchongcharan. At the same year, in July 2017, CEDAW committee expressed serious concern that women human rights defenders advocating in particular for land rights, protection of the environment, and the rights of indigenous, rural, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women, and Muslim women in southern border provinces have increasingly become target of lawsuits, harassment, violence, and intimidations by authorities and business enterprise due to their work. To protect human rights defenders have really crucial roles in supporting and empowering the victims of human rights violations, as most victims are very scared. Some victims turn themselves to be survivors and defenders. Like other countries, human rights defenders in Thailand often face threats and intimidations. Some are killed, disappeared, or discredited, while some often face judicial harassment. The most serious threats to human rights defenders in Thailand are open attacks, torture, and enforced disappearance. Human rights defenders are the liaison between civil society and the system for the protection of human rights nationally and internationally. Their role in society is fundamental to guarantee and safeguards for democracy and rule of law in Thailand. Today, an increasing number of women who have stood up to protect their civil political rights, community rights, and women's human rights. As a result, they have faced risks just like other human rights defenders. But being women human rights defenders, they have to face more complicated problems than their male counterparts. And they are vulnerable to sexual harassment or sexual violation. Apart from defenders defending human rights and their livelihood, many women have come out against large-scale industry projects which potentially affected the environment while they are pregnant or while they have breastfeeding to their babies. They also have to tend to their young children or their elderly parents while defending their community rights. Since 2014, under military government, a lot of women human rights defenders who protect their national resources and environment has been arrested, prosecuted by business enterprises or some certain government officials or agencies. Even when women have right to ask Justice Fund for bail when they were arrested, but most women human rights defenders have to raise funds to bail themselves out, since it would take more than 2 months to have access to and receive help from the Justice Fund. Moreover, the regulation of the Justice Fund Committee or the criteria, methods, and conditions for temporary release of alleged offenders or defendants 2016 allows the committee to use its discretion to assess the reason or circumstance related to the applicants, which may lead one to believe that the person has not committed anything wrong. Such criteria has allowed the committee to use its power to judge the alleged offense of human rights defenders who apply for help from the fund, even before the court make any ruling. Such act is contradictory to the Constitution and ICCPR on the presumption of innocence, whereby a person shall be considered innocent until proven guilty by the court. As former Human Rights Commissioner, on my investigation mission, I received several complaints and information through all these consultations and communications. I have come to know the repressive environment of many of the defenders work in. Across the country, human rights defenders are threatened, harassed, prosecuted, killed, or disappeared for their role on promotion and protection on human rights. Human rights defenders are continually violated, even as last year, 2019, marked the 20 years of anniversary of its adoption of UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. Several complaints indicate that the misuse of legal processes and the cost by business enterprises as a way of silencing civil society organizations and human rights defenders who raise legitimate concern and grievances related to the adverse human rights impact of business operations. Such practices are also known as strategic lawsuits against public participation. In addition, women human rights defenders have often been threatened with sexual harassment by either influential persons or certain government officials or among their male counterparts. Many women said that they have been warned that they might be victims of sexual assault if they continue their struggle. Women human rights defenders who work on women's rights, communities' rights, LGBT rights, or reproductive rights, especially on safe abortion, often face stress, intimidation, and dehumanization by some community leaders or religious leaders. Social media bullying is one of major concern. Since 2017, 4 well-known women human rights defenders in Thailand were subject to online attacks and harassment. Numerous blogs, Facebook pages, and side properties content that discredited the work of women human rights defenders by accusing them of fabrication information on human rights issues, protecting criminals, supporting death penalty, supporting insurgency, supporting safe abortion, and betray the country. Manipulated images that negatively portray the women human rights defenders and misogynistic expression were also used to vilify the defenders. Some groups of women human rights defenders are more vulnerable when they are stateless women, women with disabilities, migrants, refugees, or transgender women. One thing I want to raise in this discussion is women participation and inclusion. Most women human rights defenders were excluded from participating in negotiating or engaged to policy making, even though they work very hard with their male counterpart. But most of them are left behind and sometimes their voice not being heard. In a number of areas I visit, I'm heartened by sacrifice of women human rights defenders, the women who never been named, women who work very hard for a better life of the new generation. Some might heard the stories of great women human rights defenders like Mae Sompong Vieng Chan, Mae Mani in Isan, who fight against Pak Moon Dam or Mine Khong for more than 40 years. Or Kun Karot Wak Atson, wife of Kun Charan, who was killed in 2008 when the anti-coal power in Prachuap Khiri Khan province. The stories of these great women are inspired by the new generation of women human rights defenders, even though they were prosecuted or faced so many kinds of threat and intimidation, but they never give up. 15 years of my experiences, I have found that it's very difficult for victims, especially women, to fight for justice. Many of victim families hide themselves from society because they are very scared. I also found during my struggle for truth and justice that we have to work and cooperate with all stakeholders. We should not work alone, and we have to show our independence and integrity. Some might think that if someone disappeared or his or her were detained in prison, the problems will disappear. But is this not true? As they will have more and more women human rights defenders to follow his or her path from 10 to 1,000, and the struggle will continue. In this very important moment on the Human Rights Month, I wish to encourage all women human rights defenders to continue doing the right things to protect human rights and the rule of law in our respective countries. Even as while we are working harder and harder, we have to face more barriers, especially the criminal defamation to silence us. But I believe that we will never give up and our struggle will continue. As former Human Rights Commissioner, I often attacked by some business enterprise. Early this year, I was attacked by the member of parliament, and I'm one who faced this criminal defamation when I protected women human rights defenders. But I never afraid such kind of this harassment, as it cannot stop me to continue my work. And I'm very happy and honored to stand with all women human rights defenders. Colleagues, history tells us again and again that ordinary women can make difference for changes. I salute to all women human rights defenders for their big hearts and never surrender and still have hope to make change for better life. I do believe that together we can make it. I leave you with that thought, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kunankana. I think your speech was very insightful and ended up with hope. And you encouraged us not to stop, and I don't think we're stopping here. As glim as it has been, Kunankana had given the picture of women human rights defenders in Thailand facing several gender-specific challenges and are suffering increased risks, suffering prejudice, exclusion. Exclusion here means isolation or even isolated from financing. Stigmatization in comparison to their male counterparts. This also is faced by women's political activists in Thailand, by judicial harassment, online, physical intimidation, by the name and in the name of social order or social cohesion. Our final panelist today, Kun Pranam Somwong. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kun Manjura. Good morning, everybody. Special greeting to all women human rights defenders here. Also, the Ambassador Stefan, Ambassador Maidi, the member of the media, and the distinguished panelists. It's super happy to have the women panelists here talk about women's rights, which is very rare in Thailand and also in FCCT. So well done, Swedish Embassy and also the FCCT. We talk about, I'm not going with PowerPoint, I'm just putting some photos from the local power actor for us to see. So if we can set them just to run for us to see, because we're not fortunate enough to have all women from the community here, but I'm trying to capture some of the moment of the powerful, resourceful and resilience of the women from the community which we work for and work with in Thailand, but also some of them are from Southeast Asia region, because we already start to work with the women human rights defender in Burma, Myanmar, Indonesia, Cambodia, India, and also in Thailand. I like to start because when we talk about shrinking space, this is the Southeast Asian women, we had the Resistor dialogue together in the south of Thailand. We work now with the Lilak, the indigenous women organization from Philippines, providing the space of the resilience together with the women human rights defender in this region. But when we talk about shrinking space, it's reminding me of thinking about we watch a church, because it's shrinking, no? So we watch a church and it shrinks. It means that the church may no longer fit you. It used to be fit you when you bought it, yeah? But for most of the women and human rights defender, the church never fit them from very beginning, yeah? And normally women are the one who usually do washing of the clothes. So my point is, we can't simply assume that the space are equal at the beginning. The space are not equal at the first place. So shrinking is also trust not equal. And I try to think, because the end of the year, we reflecting a lot on gender equality. So I like to ask some of the questions which might be provocative. So let's have that. For example, we can't anymore simply talking about gender equality and simply look at because of gender inequality. What are we talking about here? Do we want to be treated as the same way of Rohingya man who faced genocide? No. Do we want to treat the same way with the fisherman, the poor fisherman in the community who were exploited? No. So we also talking much more complexity of inequality in this. And in gender, there much more there about race, about class, about the power in different level of the structure. We also need to asking the question on how some men, as the institutional, but also some women ourselves, are also contributing to a shrinking of the other women's space. Sometimes we take up the space of the other women and we don't want to share them with more women. We even support sometimes the policy that shrink the rights of the other women, like the sexist and protective migration policy. Are we against the fundamental rights of the women to work or some occupation, like sex worker? We simply against prostitution, so it means we also against the women who work in that occupation. That contribute to the shrinking more of the rights of the women. So we must be clear. Actually, we're talking about not the new church, because the shirt never fit women at the beginning. It cannot be replacement for the trunk shirt, but we want the whole entire wardrobes. With women are making that decision of that wardrobes, and we can make decision as well together about how the structural change we want to see, which we're making them every day. The space of the grassroots women in Thailand has always very, very tiny. Like that's what Kun Angkana already mentioned, and also some of them, as Cynthia mentioned. But now it has even shrunk even further. But also, I share the analysis from the previous speaker as well. In the recent year, it's a rising tide of the women and youth activism. It has swept across the world, online and on the street. Certainly, it's in community as well. Millions of the women and youth have raised their voices and called for action against violence, systematic abuse, harassment, discrimination, destruction of our environment and community livelihood. The women in Thailand are joining this tide of activism for the last 4 or 5 years. Oh, actually even more last than 5 years, because we are quite in the authoritarian state. But it's happening, it's more resistance happening. More grassroots women human rights defender. Many of them are women and the mothers. Before I would talk about resistance initiative, we again would like to emphasize that already Kun Angkana saying, women who standing behind seeking the justice under the enforced disappearance, extrajudicial killing, judicial harassment, public online attack, but also dealing with stigmatization, which is happening every day. Forced eviction, right now we have 8,000 family at least under forced eviction in Thailand, and destruction of the family, of the environmental and the family livelihood. But locally, in the daily basis, we work with the grassroots, women and men human rights defender, who has a very wide range of the good practice and survival strategies. They are being enhanced and strengthened by the collective organizing between the sectors. They are very, very innovative and creative, used among of the others, public participation, but also art as a tool for resistance and social change. You will see some of the photos there. Last month, on 21st November 2019, 40 women went to the parliament, including Mae Sompong. Kun Angkana talk about the legend of the women human rights defender, Mae Sompong from Assembly of the Poor. Mae Sompong, together with the 40 women, went to the Thai parliament. There were representatives of the 19 groups from Community Women Human Rights Defender Collective, who representing the interest and demands of the many millions of the women in Thailand. The collective Women Human Rights Defender announced the beginning of the creation of Women Manifesto for Thailand. And they used that opportunity to request the parliamentarian and the Thai government to show more support for women human rights defender. They also say they're also requesting the government to give them the big bust in next year, in the International Women's Day. They are a little bit exhausting to demand some complication to the Thai government because it's never been followed. So the women said this time, we give you some time until March. We ask for the bust for us to be able from March 8th next year to go around Thailand and working on a Women Manifesto of Thailand together. And some of the demand of the Women Human Rights Defender, you will get some of the pamphlet here. I borrow from you, Angkana now. It's some of the pamphlet you're having here with you is the main 6 demands of the women collective on the Constitution. For example, some of their demands are that the Constitution must be based on respect for human rights, including the rights of all women. These include, but is not limited to, the rights of disabled women, indigenous women, lesbian and transgender women, refugees and migrant women, also women in the deep south of Thailand. Principle in the Constitution must support the creation of the law to uphold the rights of the women from various sectors, regardless of the culture, language, religions, or political beliefs. We have so much of the problem of the conflict of political beliefs in Thailand. educational level or occupation, that's including respect of the rights of women who do sex work, domestic work, women who working in home or in land, and very important, women in the prison. The new constitution must require the state to recognize the work in the home has a great social and economic value. We talk about caring work in the home must be compensated by the state in the living wages, which can be in the form of the cash, give them the land, or give them the state welfare. We know that women doing the national work, we so-called traditional work of the women, but this must be value. This must be give economic compensate to women. And we think if doing the household work, gain money or earn their salary, maybe more men will join us to do so. Also, women collective demand for the serious reduction in military power and spending in Thailand in order to reduce injustice and to make available the fund which need to fulfill state duty of the care of all the people in Thailand. Because Thailand facing, we are number one inequality in Thailand, when the 1% of the rich, the elite, and the powerful are owning 69% of the asset. We need the support for more space and resources for community women rights defenders to come together as the collective, to exploring their unique role as the women in the movement and the way to make movement more inclusive for all women. We have some example. If you see a very beautiful mosaic, and Kun Angkana also joined that project called Quilt for Resistance. So women human rights defenders in Thailand are now embroidering their story on the clothes from last year. We continue this year, making the quilt. This peaceful resistance, using an art form as storytelling, have also receiving great public support. And we're not even launching them yet. We plan to launch next year in February. But we received very, very great support from the public. When we launched small clip of the young women from the Deep South talking about her quilt and talking about how her life affected from the violence in the Deep South, we are now, just 1 month, receiving 70,000 people view the small clip. So I think the public appreciate the storytelling by using the work of art as a resistance. We also, in recognition of the human rights defender, past and present, on December 10, just a few days ago, at the Human Rights Day, we launched For Those Who Died Trying, and also For Those Who Still Enduring, together with Luke Dacoby, the British photographer. We did the second edition of For Those Who Died Trying, and now it's been shown exhibition at the Mai Iem Contemporary Art Museum in Chiang Mai. It's going to be shown there until February 29, 3 months there. So in that exhibition, it's also including the one who's still standing very strong, the 40 portrait of women human rights defenders in Thailand. And I have to mention that actually SIDA was originally support this For Those Who Died Trying since 2016. We also seeing the We Walk for Friendship in 2017, which saw 28 days of people marching from Thailand capital Bangkok to Khon Kaen. About 700 participants in this We Walk for Friendship, calling for civil, economic, political, and social rights, which is attract more than 3 million views from online support. This has inspired several walks, including the one concluded yesterday, when the committee from Khao Lao Yai Pa Jan Dai Forest Conservation Group in Nong Bua Lampu walked to closing the quarry in Nong Bua Lampu, and they concluded yesterday. My point is, this is the wealth of good practice on the ground, but in comparison, we do not see the same level of innovation or passion reflected in the policy and protection higher up, mainly at national level. But I also have the recommendation for international community, mainly the Friends of Thailand and the Friends of Human Rights. 5 words of solidarity and commitment from your country are very welcome, but there must be more and more. Your commitment must also be reflected in your country trade and economic policy. Remember, Clara tell us from the research that authoritarian government love economic interest than the human rights. So your intervention at political level, it need to be favored. We urge all of the countries to recognize the rights of the people is more important than opportunity for profit. Put the people first than the profit. The diplomat community must use economic and potential power to make good on its promise to ensure that Thailand are truly entering into the path for democracy, truly rules of law, not so many laws for the rules. And the people in Thailand enjoy fundamental freedom, women's rights, human rights are respected and protected. Sweden have the feminist foreign policy, and I think Canada have as well, from 200 countries in the world. This is a great initiative, but we also would like to requesting you of this policy and political support also must reach the people movement of that country, mainly in Thailand, as we're talking about Thailand now. This policy then need to translate it into feminist intent policy to become a real change for the women on the ground. It means you will need to build your capacity and adapt your system to suit the complete culture and system of the movement of the resistance. If not, only those in position of the power can access your support and will not be reached the real women human rights defender and agent of change. For the other country who hasn't had a feminist intent foreign policy, please do join Sweden. Thank you very much.
Khun Pranom, I think we hope for a wardrobe full of shirts that fits all.
No, we decided.
We decided, yes. And she's calling for our friends of human rights here to echo their commitment by translating that into trade and economic policies that are benefiting women on the ground, because equality means business. She also had mentioned that women human rights at the grassroots levels have also been targeted for rights violation by both states and private agencies, and they have to endure various forms of physical harassment and dehumanization. She had shed light a little bit brighter on younger generation, and I really like the youth empowerment and youth feminism, and we have seen in the last Beijing Plus 25 regional review on the progress on gender equality last 2 weeks in the SCAP, where SCAP and UN Women hosted. There's a bright light and the commitment of the young activism and the young people's community. Yet we still failed civil society organizations, even though we do have declarations for gender equality from that floor, but we still hearing the civil society organizations, that declaration and the language in that declaration still failed you. And we committed to make the commemoration of 25 years of Beijing Plus 25 next year stronger, echoing the rights of women, and have the rights of women and women's rights defenders at the center of our statement. Now it has come to the questions and answers, and we excellent in timekeeping, so thank you so much. So we have roughly 50 minutes for questions and answers. For bright, for somber questions, we're most welcome. Please inform us of where you're from. The microphone is back there. It's consensus. It's in a consensus. So if there's no particular questions, perhaps your comments. We can start with Ambassador. Ambassador Hastrom, would you please open the questions and answer and interactive floor, please?
I can do that by commenting upon one issue raised by Kunbi here in her intervention, which I think is very valid. This message to us, other countries, external actors, to make sure that our political commitment also is linked to human rights, to women's rights, also is linked to the hard facts and policies in trade policy, economic policy. And I think that's a very valid point. First of all, the whole idea with having a feminist foreign policy, and actually our present foreign minister, Ann Linde, during her time as trade minister, took that into the trade policy, launching the feminist trade policy and highlighting some aspects of trade injustices and inequalities that I wasn't aware of, differences, women's clothes and men's clothes and how they are treated in trade negotiations, tariffs, that kind of stuff. But I think also we are trying to do that, but also when we move now to relaunching eventually free trade negotiations between Thailand and the European Union, I think that's important. That's important avenue for raising these kind of issues. I mean, it's important to remember that free trade agreements have changed in character, and European Union trade agreements have changed in character and are now much more linked to human rights commitments and human rights mechanisms. Just take the example of how we have entered into a dialogue with Thailand on labor rights as a consequence of trade relations between European Union and Thailand. That doesn't mean that we change everything and that we manage to get things happening on the ground directly. But it's an important avenue, and I can assure you that Sweden will, within the EU, be a clear voice for having a clear stand from EU in that matter. And the other mechanism, the Business and Human Rights, new National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, that's going to be launched on Monday, where Sweden initiated recommendation on that in the Human Rights, UN Human Rights Council, and we have been supporting through UNDP this process. Now there's a plan. Second issue, more challenging implementation, and I can assure you also there that Sweden will be a very engaged and committed partner to Thailand and to Thailand civil society to make sure that the issues mentioned here, the SLAP and the harassment of human rights defenders, are clearly monitored and adhered to, addressed in that kind of process. So those are a couple of examples, not saying that we are perfect, but saying that we have taken your point and will try to make a difference.
Thank you, Ambassador. Kun Pranam, I'm so glad that you mentioned just quickly on the unpaid care work and calling for recognitions of women's in the community's contribution to the economic and social security. Perhaps you could expand a little bit of how that would contribute to sustainability in community and the situations of rights defenders. I'd like you to make some close connections.
Simply like women have been done work but not paid. So then, yes, simply like we spend too much money on military weapons and we become a country with inequality. Simply like half of the women I work for, no, actually 80% of the women in the community who I work for and work with are doing 16 hours of work because they do have to wake up at 5 o'clock, cooking, doing all the housework. One of the men, actually, the Pisom, she's the chairperson of Pho Salam region. She woke up at 4 o'clock, taking care of the child who needs special care. 5 o'clock, she putting the jacket as a motorbike taxi, going to do the motorbike taxi around her area. 8 o'clock, she have to go to Pho Salam region doing the work, which is creating the human rights for all of us. And she doesn't get paid. So that's extremely unjust. They're extremely not fair. They're extremely not any shirt we wanted to wear. So the collectives, women human rights defenders, are demanding for the resources. to pay for the household work, which many countries have been done them. I think in Iceland, having their constitution of value, economic value of the household work, is also will inform us about what kind of economic model we are going to. Because we know that the capitalism-led capital market right now is forgetting all about caring economy. It doesn't put the interest, the power, and the resources for the women who do lots of jobs. So we talk about that. We're not just simply talking about money for women. We're talking about the new economic model, which is putting more the caring. But for us to be able to do that, you pay the women who do the job first, and women will have power, have more space, have more time to sleep, and earn more decent wages. And then they can be able to participating and engaging at the policy level. Then we can have a new model of that economy model, which is more caring, which is much more human, which is doesn't leave anyone behind. We like to say that, but apparently majority of the women are left behind because they not get paid for what they do. Yeah.
Okay. Could be a note from. She would introduce herself.
I'm Pianut Khosan from Amnesty International Thailand, and thank you for organizing this event. And it's very fruitful indeed, especially this week as Human Rights Days. We also working for human rights defenders and focus on women human rights defenders, and we all want them to do their movement without risk. The challenge that we facing that we always got question that are they considered human rights defenders when they got charged or something happened to them? What about those who still doing action but have no profiles in raised in the public? And how can we support them in the way that not only capacity building, and it's a good point, we have to think about the role of women and all the expectation of the role of women in their society, community, or families, that they have to responsible maybe as a daughter, mothers, or partners. And even the public, how can publics understand these critical roles and supporting, because especially in Thailand, people probably label human rights defenders, especially politicals, and for those who lead the political movement, are cause more trouble. So it's a good opportunity to meet you guys all, and then I just want to raise this challenge point, and hopefully we have find ways together to collaborate and supporting them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I invite a second question, and then we could wrap it up? Yes, just from yourself. Sorry, we probably can't hear it, and for recording purposes, just right on the microphone, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Kalpana. I come from Center for People and Forest, an environmental NGO that works around forestry and climate change issues, primarily in Asia Pacific. Thank you so much. It was a very moving talk, and thank you for sharing your insights. Where should I begin? I think, you know, when I heard all these insights, then I was also trying to relate it to the forestry and environment and climate change section. Now climate change is considered global urgency, right? Mm-hmm. I think there is no second guess around that. And the way it is coming to this sector is also, I think it also needs attention. Why am I saying that? Because I think on one hand, the climate urgency really brought the agenda of doing something and taking actions around natural resource-based sector, calling for innovations and actions, which is positive, right? On the other hand, it privileged the technical responses to climate change solutions so much that all the social human responses somehow got watered down in that operationalization process. So there's a huge mismatch. I mean, what are we really trying to privilege here? even in the climate change agenda, right? Are we trying to, for example, just count the number of trees that are planted across the globe? Or are we also thinking about indigenous knowledge and its linkage to those trees? Are we thinking about scenarios of energy transitions, or are we also going to talk about who is going to actually access and afford these services? I think these discussions need to go hand in hand. And somehow, right now, there is a lot of emphasis around the technical solutions, like, okay, the number of hectares of trees which are planted, the number of energy actions plans which are put in place, which is great, but how can we at the same time join the human rights, the gender, the indigenous rights movement to this discourse? And there's a huge gap which is coming, and it's coming at the operation level. We have all these big policy platforms happening. We recently have this Beijing Platform for Action. We had SCOP. But then at the implementation level, these gaps are getting wider and wider. In this region, there's a lot of tendency for centralization that is happening, primarily around agriculture, forestry, and energy sector. There is a lot of plan of action which are put forward to address climate change that pays zero attention to gender, social inclusion issues. So why this mismatch is happening? So I just wanted to raise that question on how do we connect the discourses, right? And as a center which is trying to bridge this gap, I think we really need to unpack the complexity on why only certain technical economic solutions are getting so privileged at the cost of forgetting the other solution that also matter the most. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your valuable comments and question. Can I please welcome the third, and then we could close it for the first round of questions.
Dong Ramon, British Embassy, the change manager. Thank you so much for a very informative, provocative, inspiring panel. So not very often that we see all women panel. So congratulations to the British Embassy. This is a very, very great. I thought twice about coming up with asking these questions. It might sound really, you soften the contents of, we're talking human rights, a very serious topic. In the past 1 week, beginning of this week, we had this Miss Universe beauty pageants. I'm not even getting started on that, but the venue became very political, and a lot of question was actually international relation related. Anyway, our representative from Thailand was handed a questions on, I wasn't remember exactly what was that, but it was been, talking about in the past
on security,
1 week. National security, yes. To choose between the national security and your, I would say, individual rights or individual, how the government can monitor your information.
Yeah, data
so
security.
she's asking that. Mm-hmm. So I think we all have the answer. As an international community, we had the answer through which one is more important. My question is, when she was handed the questions, her first reaction was, wow, it's a tough question. I think for us, it's not that tough. I mean, to thinking about your individual rights and the national security. But my observation through that question was, why is it a tough question? Is it because of being Thai that we're not so free to even thinking about our own individual rights, and we're afraid to say this is what we prefer, as opposed to the national security? So anyway, so that's the observation which I'm going to throw it out there, and you can comment on. My real question is that what would we do with the governments? I'm not talking just these countries in general, of how we use the national security narrative all the time, giving that narrative to their people, while we try to work on defending individual rights. I think I leave it there, but that venue was kind of triggered these questions of national security versus individual rights, and undermining the work of defending the individual.
Thank you very much. So there are 3 questions on protections, and supporting mechanism. So I probably would please divert that to Clara. And question number 2, on how we address the discourse and unpack the discourse, could I please give it to Cynthia? And number 3, on national security narratives versus data security, could I please give it to Kun Ankana to address? Clara, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's obviously a really difficult question because it is a huge challenge to ensure the protection of activists. I would say that firstly, it needs to happen both on an individual and organizational level. Kvinna till Kvinna, my organization has worked with a concept called integrated security for I think around 15 years, which is about the security for women human rights defenders, but it's also about creating sustainable organizations, because I really thought about that when Bee spoke earlier on the sort of the energy and the drive of these activists. They will keep working with no pay for long hours, taking care of their homes, their families, their children, their parents, and then go to unpaid human rights work and just keep going. And our role as Kvinna till Kvinna has actually been to tell them to slow down a little bit, and also take care of themselves, because they always put themselves last, and to create sustainable organizations, which we need because we know it will probably take decades to achieve our results. We need also sustainable activism, so that's a really important part of it. On the protection side, it's what is needed there is a very thorough contextual analysis, because it is really from case to case. If the best thing is to really highlight and spread the word about the individual activism, because that can be a way of protecting them and showing support from embassies and the UN to show that this person cannot be touched, basically. And sometimes it's better to let the person go more underground, or to even leave the country. And going back to my point on also flexible funding, to actually have crisis funding for when activists need to leave their current situation because it's too dangerous. That's a really important thing to increase, because there's not a lot of those funds to be sought after. And then there was a last point on how do we get more support from the public, which I think is really interesting, because the image of women human rights defenders or feminist activists as troublemakers is interesting. It sometimes may be true, but in a good way, I think. But what I think is interesting, what's happening now with a lot of the public protests and demonstrations that we see all across the world, is that these are not issues that just a few sort of elite activisms care about. It's something that all people care about. And I really hope that the feminist movement can link into the energy that we now see in a lot of these demonstrations, because there's obviously power in those numbers and in the people's movements. So yeah, I'll end there. Thank you.
And maybe just one thing on the first question, if I may say, is the question of education, and the importance of education to the general public about why human rights matters for them. And I think this is where we see the discourse as it takes off and is being instrumentalized or politicized by various leaders across the world, that is against both human rights but also women's rights. I think we need to redouble our efforts as human rights defenders to educate people about why these principles remain of the essence for us today. On the second point, I could speak for a very long time on this issue, both because the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, with thanks also to Sweden, have started to do work on climate change and human rights, but also because personally I feel very committed to this area of work. I think there are a number of issues that, in terms of how we could look at this. I will, of course, leave them unnamed, but we have had a few Western member states of the UN react, and it's probably not the one you're thinking of, but react to our engagement on climate change and human rights in a negative way, to say, I think you need to remain on the civil and political rights side of the spectrum, because this business about climate change and human rights, well, you know, it's really difficult to actually identify the nexus between those. And I mean, I really had to pull myself together a little bit and say respectfully, well, it's really difficult to understand how that nexus couldn't be so obvious. We're talking about food security, we're talking about right to clean water, we're talking about right to a healthy environment, we're talking about enormous potential displacement in the coming years, which of course is a human rights issue at its core. We're talking about right to adequate housing, on and on, right to livelihood. We could go on and on. I mean, everything enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is a given, but of course also in the civil and political arena. But there are two other components of this that I brought to their attention, which I think we all need to keep in our advocacy toolkit on this issue. Besides the individual rights that are so clearly involved in the climate change debacle that is unfolding across the world, let us look at the 2030 Agenda, and let us look at the guiding principles on business and human rights. Both of those platforms, at its core, and I mentioned this in my speech, at its core hold participation as the most critical element for success. And that means that on issues around the 2030 Agenda, any of those development goals require that governments or member states engage in a meaningful manner, and I think we all know what meaningful means, meaningful manner, a diverse group of people across their societies that will be part of decision making, and of course that includes women. But if we do not hold member states to account on this issue of participation and leaving no one behind, which we, frankly, I think the Secretary General said when he did a stock taking this year, we are losing the thread on participation and losing the thread on leaving no one behind in achieving our goals as a global community in the 2030 Agenda. So we must, and I look to the international community, I look to our UN agencies, we must hold governments to account in the implementation of their 2030 Agenda on their ability to engage all groups across their society in meaningful participation. And the second thing is on the guiding principles of business and human rights. While I applaud governments for their interest in embarking on meaningful implementation, if they are on the one hand saying that they are moving forward with plans and many other things, and on the other hand shutting down civic space, criminalizing those very people who come forward on whether it's the environment or climate change or to raise very serious and egregious problems by the business community, if they are criminalizing those very people on a routine basis, we cannot give them credit for implementing the guiding principles on business and human rights. And that is incumbent upon us as the international community, UN, diplomats, to say, hold on, you cannot have these two things at the same time going on and get credit for these guiding principle implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Kunankana, could you comment on the national security versus data security?
Thank you, Kun. Thank you for the question. For the question about privacy and social good or national security, I think this this issue come really popularized now. Many people talking about how we can balancing about privacy, right to privacy and social good. Even Thailand Constitution guarantee the rights of people, the rights of freedom of expression, and this, I think this is first time that constitution, Thai constitution talking mention about privacy, and we just have the organic law on privacy, so that it's very challenging. By the way, in Article 19 of ICCPR mentioned about freedom of expression, but it has some restriction about national security also. So from my experience, I think it's very important that how can we balance, and how I think most of the problem happen when the official, the government official, try to discretion, and they have very strictly not allow people to do this on that on behalf of national security. I remember in March 2017 when Thailand go to Geneva to review the convention on ICCPR. The ICCPR committee asking Thailand that in Article 17, Paragraph 2 of Gender Equality Act, why it have, what the reason Thailand have exception on national security that can discriminate women. Nobody can reply. The Thai delegation cannot reply, even the head of the delegation. Ajahn Vitit also joined us in Geneva. Nobody can reply what the reason that we can discriminate the rights of women on behalf of national security. So it seems that during the past 5 years under the military government, that we have many acts that have the last sentence mentioned about national security. So I think the most important is about how we balancing and how we can check. Maybe people can ask the court if they think that they were violated by the national, by the security forces. We not now we have for the special branch and some of the security forces, they often use the IO information operation to attack a lot of people, especially human rights defenders, attack their private life, personal life. Sometimes it's very bad. No? That when you say that some picture, very confidential picture of you, and sometimes the state official can hack in the social media. I often have a meeting with the Facebook and WhatsApp, and often communicate with them how they can protect the rights of the user or customer, or not, because under the law said very clearly that for national security, for the rights of the people, it can be restriction only the security forces have concrete evidence so that they can stop people from something. And the law said that to use the restriction, it must have limited time. They cannot have a broad, like the emergency decree law in the South that extend every 3 months for more than 15 years, and it still apply. So I think we have to discuss this very seriously in the country. Yeah.
Thank you. Definitely. Yes.
I think national security never take it back to human security. We have to be clear, that's the threat to the government security or the threat to the public security. So that's disclosure, it has to be clear. Because many times the government in power are very much using not the concrete evidence about the threat to safety to the public. The real threat to safety to the public, that only small, tiny, that allows state to do surveillance. But it's misused. It doesn't talk about human security, it doesn't talk about, and also actually right to privacy have a little problem on the domestic violence, the rights of the women. So it's so many complexity there, but it means the citizen should be able to not giving the data to the state, which is maybe misused against them. In Thailand, we have a force to check the DNA in deep south of Thailand. What about that? Is that national security, or is that right to privacy of who? Because they don't have it, they're forced to check it. I think it's a lot. I think it's a good debate to look at them and see how public perception is also doing that. And we'd actually, in one of their Facebook page, we're creating that cartoon and asking the people, if you have to answer that question, what you would, and many Thais are come and answer those questions. It's good to see how the public perceiving them. On the issue of individual activists, I think we need to work on public policy together to develop the cohesive but effective protection strategy, which is respond to the need of individuals but collectives' need of human rights defender. We cannot address only individual rights of human rights defender because it's non-political. We can't go to the political and holding impunity accountable if we do only individual. So that's why we encourage government to work with the collective power which already developed to develop that public policy. Rights to defend human rights is still a main goal for us to achieve, and many more tools to do that together. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps we can start the second round of question. I see the young rights defenders in the corner over there on that table. Do you have any particular points or observations as the torch of human rights defenders being passed on to the younger generation? And of course, it's our duty to give that voice and space to you. Do you want to make some comments on this, please? May I invite the young rights defender?
I think Forum Asia work a lot with human rights defenders, especially women. So, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Hi. Thank you for giving me this space to share. I don't really have a specific question, but I'd love to make a comment. I really like what PB said about art as a tool of resistance and social change. I think it's great to see that there are other strategies being used to kind of ensure that human rights is accessible to the public. And yeah, it's really inspiring to see the movement of women human rights defenders in Thailand as well. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think the form of art could help mystify somehow and debug social norms on women's human rights defenders. Kun Pranom, perhaps you could give light to us on how you mentioned about creativity and a new way of new collectives.
Yeah, before that, I would like to mention Forum Asia launched the report on defending in number, and also very clear for Forum Asia to also having the statistic of 70% of the human rights defender who being killed under attack are environmental and land rights defender, and most of them are also women in this region. I think as a tool for changing perception and narratives. So art is one tool, but art has to be a companion with the other, like public policies to work with the government authorities, but also supporting the work of human rights defenders themselves. Either they go to the street and using the Peaceful Assembly Act, not using it because the act is not good. It's not allow peaceful assembly. So repeal the bad law. So I think we're talking about the whole comprehensive fostering enabling environment, which is art is part of it, because we have to change public perception. So art is a tool, but to be able to change public perception, public need more time and resources and engagement to also thinking about how human rights are important to them. So go back to the basic issue which public are talking about, bad economic recession, freedom, which is people cannot be able to use. I think we have to go back to simply question on what the public interest in that time.
May I add
Thank
a
you.
bit? I think that for art, it's not only for campaigning, but I think it's one thing that's very important is like some kind of how the victims for healing. Yeah, their mind.
Using art as a healing method.
So for myself, I often sewing or working on cross stick, very big, Yeah, and also I joined the program of quit, and it's my preferable, and I think that I often make it when I feel stressed, and I think it's very good.
Yes, thank you so much. Art manifests itself in different forms, from quilting, from music, from storytelling and photo exhibition, completely uncontested here. May I have the last question from the floor, Natalie?
Yes, my name is Natasiri Bergman. I'm working with Human Rights Lawyer Association. And Human Rights Lawyer Association represent the case that human rights defender facing, the slap case that the panelists just mentioned. And most of them just merely like comment on the online platform. And they do not feel that the thing that they are mentioned online is really a threat at all. And the thing is, they continue working with all of these cases that they are facing. I'm wondering, as many of the panelists are working with the human rights defenders, how do you talking with all of these human rights defenders? Because when I engaging with them, they do not feel that their work is really under threat at all. Because when we talk on the defending of the case, it's difficult to sometimes when they feel threat and intimidated, they do not express themselves and they just disappear. So I want to know, how do you encourage them and give them the support? Thank you so much.
So the issues of isolation and forced isolations of women's human rights defenders by not recognizing that they are under threats themselves. So would Kun Ankana, and then could I invite Clara? Yes, maybe Clara could start off with. Thank you.
Fill in. I think that's true for a lot of women activists to not see themselves as vulnerable. And that because I've organized many meetings with participants from all across the world, and a very common sort of reflection is always that, oh, I didn't know that everyone else was experiencing this. I thought that I was alone, and they weren't sort of validating their own experiences as reflecting also of sort of global policy, or they don't link it to the political world. They only see it as something personal happening to them, which I think is also a quite gendered experience, that we women tend to do that. So the important sort of key here is, in my opinion, movement building on a local level, on a national level, and on a global level, because as soon as you do that, you also realize that those connections and meetings between women activists always sort of result in great political discussions with so much insight and concrete sort of recommendations from what is needed to be done on the local, on the national, on the global level. So just creating spaces to meet, to network, and to build movements, and usually the sort of the change of mindset towards yourself also, that sort of happens automatically after that, usually, is my experience.
Thank you. Please, yes, could I have the final remarks, final answer perhaps from
Okay.
I
think nobody wanted to be human rights defender.
Really?
Or women human rights defender, because it means you're under attack. Psychologically, we not choose to be women human rights defender. We may choose our activism, how social we would like to change. But when you become women human rights defender, most of the time it means you're under attack. So that is narrative we are working on, yeah? And we don't get that recognition enough about how much we have to deal with that when you're under the repression. I guess number two is PI work as a preventive on risk assessment, and that's we always advocating for preventive measure, but also public policy, because we should not focus on the one who defend human rights, because they should be able to do so. We should focus on perpetrator, abuser, the one who attack human rights defender. So we have to balance on what are we pay specific attention to. People, women need to know when they speak out about rape, domestic violence, speak out about abuse, or any political will they would like to see, they won't be attacked. That's something we should spend energy more and more together. And actually well aware of many human rights defenders, they know the risk, but they decide to take a risk. It's our job to work in companion with them, to be able to take a risk, but in the same time, still safe when you still defend human rights. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's actually a perfect closing. Oh, Kun Angkana, would you like to give a final?
I want to add a bit about why people want to post something on the Facebook. I want to say that for Thailand, evidence is very important. I remember first case that I used to help the indigenous people when he posted a video clip in his Facebook that on the New Year of indigenous people in northern Thailand, the military came to join, and then he drunk and he slapped the face of a woman. So this man, he take the video clips and post in the Facebook, and then he was prosecuted. So the soldiers went to the village and tried to force the team to delete, and the case was sent to the court. I think this is very simple, that actually for women human rights defenders and human rights defenders, mostly I didn't say they post like the food or whatever, but mostly what they're posting in the Facebook is about their work, and they want public to know what they are doing. And I think this is one thing that public can know what happened. And by the way, the company not happy, and some state officials too, they're not happy. I have some recommendation. I think that on 29 October this year, the Cabinet resolution agreed of National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And one thing, the highlight is on human rights defenders.
So
maybe the diplomat communities can help to follow this and encourage the Ministry of Justice how they can apply or adopt the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders to protect human rights defenders.
Thank you. This is a perfect New Year gift for the community to have the NAP, National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. That will close our panel discussion today. For those who defend our rights in turn need our defense. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to join and moderate this vibrant discussion today, and thank you for your participation. The floor is yours, Ambassador Hastrom. Thank you.
I'm asked to make closing remarks and invite you to the exhibition. Well, the exhibition is quite easy to invite to. To make closing remarks more challenging, let me, just before I forget it, mention another event, since some pieces of this discussion has dealt with art. So tonight, the European Union will have an event on the theme of the art of human rights at the Yellow House. I will be there myself, just to give you a heads up on that. But thank you all, and particularly the panelists for an extremely rich discussion. I mean, I listened to many panel discussions. It's seldom that you get so much of substance with you. I was moved by much, but first and foremost by Kun Jun's reflections in her introductory speech related to the picture. This is about the exhibition, and I also reflected about that picture, like you did, and I see so much of endurance and dedication, which I think is an inspiration to us all, very much from the other pictures as well. But today, Kun Jun is our key personality. I we need voices. We need voices of human rights defenders. We need voices of women human rights defenders. And we see also new voices of a new generation, also here, but also on the global arena. This has been the year and is the year where Greta Thunberg from Sweden, but also here in Thailand, Kun Lili from Bye Bye Plastics, and Kun Lin from Climate Strike Thailand, it's called Climate Action Thailand. I've met them both, extremely inspiring, and I think they also remind us of this crucial links that have been highlighted here. Environment and climate, human rights, that's not two agendas, those are agendas that need to be merged for all these good reasons that have been mentioned. We need to connect these discourses. It's not a question of them being separate. These are part of the same reality. And we try to do that also in our, as Sweden, in our development cooperation, not least. In her introduction, Clara had one of the recommendations, put human rights and women's rights on the agenda all the time. And it might be sort of sounding self-evident, but I think that's an important message to people like me, to people, politicians, to governments, to do that. Also, when the circumstances are not that encouraging, when you are making trouble and when you're creating uncomfortable situations around a dinner table among friends, or when you're sitting with a minister from a government that needs to hear those remarks. That's a message that we need to implement even more in reality in the future. And then a couple of, finally, encouraging messages of hope. As Kun Jun said, let us dream about a society, about a world where human rights is not a matter of fight, but a matter of fact. I will internalize that in both my mental state when I'm sort of depressed, but also when I go to my work as ambassador. And then, as Cynthia said, women are changing the world, and we are not done yet. Or like Konankana said, together we can make it. I think that's exactly why we're here today, because as single individuals, yes, we are all important, yes, we have all a responsibility, but we need to work together. And let this be a message, a final message also from me on behalf of my embassy and our government to women human rights defenders. We stand by you. That's why we're here, and we stand by you. Thank you very much for coming.